The Vethkarn poisoned our water. We poisoned them back with something they never saw coming. The will to remember. The colony ship, Ardent Crossing, had been in orbit above Vareth 5 for 11 days before Marin Solis finally admitted to herself that something was wrong with the settlement below. She noticed it first in the biometric feeds. Small deviations. Nothing the automated systems flagged, because the systems were looking for the obvious markers. Accelerated heart rate, elevated cortisol, the biochemical fingerprints of physical threat. What the systems weren't looking for, because no one had thought to program them for it, was the specific and terrible pattern she was beginning to recognize from the psych literature she'd read during the 6-month transit, the pattern that looked, on a data graph, like a slow wave, like something rising. She was sitting in the observation blister, a curved bubble of reinforced polymer, pressed against the outer hull of the Ardent Crossing. When she pulled up the feeds for the 40th time that week, a cold cup of synthesized coffee sat beside her knee, forgotten. Outside, Vareth 5 turned in its slow rotation, a green-brown world smaller than Earth, with 2 battered moons and an atmosphere that had taken humanity's best terraforming teams 9 years to render survivable. Below, in the township of Reach Below, 2,417 human colonists were living their first year on a new world. She watched the numbers. She thought about the call she'd gotten 3 days ago from her brother Dane. It had come in on the standard comm relay, voice only, which was normal for long-distance surface-to-ship contact. What wasn't normal was the way Dane had spoken. She'd known her brother her entire life, 31 years, half of which they'd spent on colony postings together, first as children following their parents from station to station, then as adults choosing the same frontier life independently, for reasons neither of them had ever quite articulated, but both had always understood. Dane was the kind of man who chose his words carefully, who said things precisely and meant them completely. He was the calmest person she had ever known, in the particular way of someone who has looked at the genuine darkness of deep space travel and decided, quietly and without ceremony, that panic was a waste of energy. On the call 3 days ago, he had not sounded like that. He had said, the Vethkarn were right to claim this soil. He had said, the other colonists understood now, the ones who'd been here long enough, the ones who weren't still hiding behind regulations and protocols, and the comfortable illusions of Earth mind. He had said, in a voice that belonged to someone she didn't recognize, you should come down, Marin. Drink the water. See what's real. She'd ended the call and sat very still for a long time. Then she'd pulled up the psych literature. Then she'd pulled up the biometric feeds. Now she sat in the observation blister, with her cold coffee and her rising certainty, watching the data spike and plateau and spike again. And she thought, the Vethkarn did this. And she thought, nobody up here knows. And she thought, very quietly, the way she'd thought all the hardest thoughts in her life. Not with fear, but with a precise and particular focus that she had inherited from no one, and built herself, out of necessity, across 31 years of frontier living. I am going to have to go down there. The Vethkarn were not the first alien species humanity had encountered, but they were the first that had been openly hostile from the initial contact moment. The others, the Sarathi, the Tull Collective, the quiet and inscrutable beings, humanity's xenolinguists still called the Architects, because no one had managed a proper name for them, had been, in various ways, indifferent. The Vethkarn were not indifferent. The Vethkarn had made their position clear within the first 72 hours of formal contact. The 14 worlds in what human cartographers called the Vareth Cluster were Vethkarn sovereign territory, had been for 11,000 years by their reckoning. And the presence of human settlers on any of those worlds was an act of trespass that would be addressed. The address had taken 15 years to arrive in any formal way, which was either a sign of Vethkarn patience or a sign of how long their internal political processes took. No one was entirely certain which. The Vethkarn were tall. bipedal in a loose biological sense, and built along lines that looked almost mammalian until you got close enough to see the secondary sensory arrays fanned along their jawlines, and the way their eyes didn't track movement, the way vertebrate eyes did, but instead held a fixed focal depth that was unnerving to humans, in the particular way of things that look familiar until they suddenly don't. They communicated through a layered system of tonal speech and pheromonal signaling that human linguists had mapped to about 60% accuracy, which meant that about 40% of any Vethkarn statement was being guessed at. The colonists on Vareth 5 had been told this. Most of them had treated it as an abstract political concern, the kind of interstellar complication that got handled by people with diplomatic credentials somewhere far away from the work of building a settlement and planting crops and raising children on new soil. What the colonists had not been told, because the people who knew hadn't yet understood what they were looking at, was that the Vethkarn had another way of addressing trespass. Marin's official designation on the Ardent Crossing was Mission Medical Officer, which meant she was responsible for the health of the 212 people currently aboard the ship. The crew complement the remaining settlers awaiting surface rotation, the administrative and technical staff. It also meant, technically, that her jurisdiction extended to the settlement below, though in practice, the surface colony had its own medical team. And her role up here was oversight, consultation, emergency response. It was the emergency response part of her job that she was thinking about when she went to find Commander Osi. Kwame Osi was in the operations bay, running a diagnostic on the atmospheric sensors, a task he absolutely could have delegated to any one of a dozen qualified technicians, but which he was doing himself, because Kwame was the kind of commander who needed to keep his hands on something physical when the situation wasn't certain. Marin had known him for 4 years and had learned to read this habit accurately. When Kwame ran his own diagnostics, it meant he was already worried about something. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. "You've seen the feeds," she said. He didn't look up from the sensor panel. "I've seen the feeds. And I've been on the comm with the Colonial Authority relay for the last 6 hours." He set down the tool he was holding, turned to face her. Kwame was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had absorbed a lot of difficult news over a long career and learned not to show it, except in the particular tightening around the eyes that Marin was seeing right now. They're describing it as a settlement adaptation, possible psychological stress response to first-generation colonization pressure. They want a full psych evaluation workup on the affected individuals and a 60-day observation window before any intervention protocol is authorized. Marin looked at him. 60 days, she said. 60 days. The behavioral deviations in the surface feeds have progressed 40% in the last 72 hours. She said it evenly, the way she'd said hard things to patients. At that rate, we're looking at a complete breakdown of social functionality in the settlement within 3 weeks, maybe less. Kwame's jaw worked. "I know. The Colonial Authority is working with models that don't account for external vector involvement. They're treating this as endogenous, a human problem with a human solution." She paused. "It's not endogenous, Kwame." The silence that followed was the kind that meant he'd already reached the same conclusion and had been waiting for someone else to say it first. "The water reclamation system," he said. "The intake feeds draw from the Vareth 5 subsurface aquifer network. The aquifer runs directly beneath the Vethkarn territorial marker field, to the north of the settlement. She'd mapped it 3 times, checking her work each time because she'd wanted to be wrong. There's a compound in the water. I've been isolating it from the passive environmental sampling data for the last 4 days. I don't have a full molecular profile yet. The sensors up here aren't calibrated for Vethkarn biochemistry. But the behavioral correlation is clear. Whatever's in the water is specifically and selectively targeting human impulse inhibition." Kwame was very still. "You mean it's not accidental?" Nothing that precisely targeted is accidental. She said it without anger, though she felt the anger, deep and banked and slow burning. The Veth Karn knew what the aquifer connected to. They knew what the compound would do. They put it there before we arrived, or activated it after, and then they waited. Why not just? He stopped himself. Because this is cleaner, she said. If the colony destroys itself from the inside, there's no act of aggression on record, no diplomatic incident, no justification for a colonial authority military response. We just become another settlement that failed, another cautionary footnote about the psychological toll of first-generation colonization. She let that sit for a moment. It's elegant, in a horrible way. They understand exactly how our institutions work. They're using our own processes against us. Kwame picked up the sensor tool again, set it down again. It was the first time she'd ever seen him do that twice. The colonial authority won't authorize intervention without a confirmed external vector identification, he said. I can push for an expedited review, but we're still looking at, I know. She'd already run those numbers. That's why I'm going down. Marin, I need samples from the water system intake directly. Ground truth. Something I can put in front of the colonial authorities' xenobiochemistry division and say this is what's in your settlers, and here is where it came from, and here is what the Veth Karn did. She was already moving toward the equipment bay in her mind, already running the list of what she'd need. Once I have that, you have your justification for a full emergency protocol. Evacuation of unaffected personnel, medical intervention for the affected, formal diplomatic complaint through proper channels. You haven't been down there in 11 days. If it's progressing the way you're describing, I know what I'll find. She kept her voice steady. My brother is down there, Kwame. Most of the original survey crew is down there. I'm not going to sit on this ship and watch them finished, destroying each other, while the colonial authority runs a 60-day observation window. He looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes, she could see the calculation, the risk to her against the need for the data against the clock, ticking against the institutional walls he'd been banging against for 6 hours, with nothing to show for it. She could also see, beneath all of that, the thing that made Kwame Osei a good commander rather than just a competent one. He understood that sometimes the right call and the authorized call were not the same thing. I can't officially sanction this, he said. I know. I can, however, run a routine medical resupply mission to the surface. Standard protocol. 1 medical officer, personal equipment allowance, return transit open-ended, tinned pending surface conditions. He picked up his diagnostic tool for the 3rd time and went back to the sensor panel. I'll file the paperwork. She took the shuttle down alone. The descent through Vareth 5's atmosphere was smooth. This world had none of the violent upper-level turbulence that made some colony approaches genuinely dangerous. Through the forward viewport, she watched the green-brown surface resolve from abstraction into detail. The ridgeline of the Vareth Range to the north, the long flat of the agricultural plateau where reach below had been sighted, the glint of the water reclamation facility catching the light of Vareth's sun. The sun here was slightly redder than Earth's, which gave the light a particular quality in the late afternoon, warm and amber, almost honeyed, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being seen through old glass. She thought of her brother. She thought of the first time they'd stood together on alien soil. She'd been 9, he'd been 12, on the Caliver Station colony, where their parents had been posted for a 3-year survey contract. There had been a moment, the first night, when the two of them had snuck out of the family quarters and stood in the open and looked up at a sky full of unfamiliar stars, and Dane had put his arm around her shoulders and said, very quietly, "We could go anywhere, you know. From here we could get to anywhere." And she had understood, at 9 years old, that this was the thing about humans. Not that they were brave or strong or clever, though they were sometimes all of those things, but that they were genuinely, constitutionally incapable of seeing a horizon without wanting to know what was on the other side of it. That quality had put them here. on a world that something else had decided was not theirs to reach. The shuttle touched down on the pad at the edge of reach below, with a soft thunk of landing struts, and Marin picked up her kit and stepped out into the amber afternoon. The first thing she noticed was the quiet, not silence. The settlement was never silent. There was always the background noise of environmental systems, and the distant hum of the power grid, and the sounds that 2,000 people make, even when they're trying to be still. But the particular kind of noise a healthy human settlement made, the overlapping voices, the children, the machinery of daily life operating at its normal pitch, that was muted, thinned, as if the frequency that carried human purposefulness had been turned down. The second thing she noticed was a man she vaguely recognized from the crew, Manifest, sitting in the middle of the main plaza, unmoving, staring at nothing she could identify, just sitting, not sleeping, not waiting for someone. His posture wasn't that of a person waiting. It was the posture of a person who had simply stopped. She walked past him with her kit. She kept moving. The medical station was in the center of reach below, a long building of prefab panels, with a green stripe painted along its exterior. The colonial, standard for medical facilities, easily identified at a distance. She'd calmed ahead to the surface medical lead, Dr. Priya Reyes, partly to coordinate and partly to find out if Reyes had noticed what Marin had noticed. The response she'd gotten back had been terse, factual in a way that bordered on mechanical. "Come ahead, we have cases." Reyes met her at the station entrance. She was a woman of about 40, dark-haired, with the specific exhaustion in her face that Marin associated with medical workers who had been running on adrenaline and were starting to come down from it at the worst possible time. She didn't say anything when Marin arrived, just held the door. Inside, the station smelled like antiseptic and the faint mineral tang of the air recyclers, working hard. There were 7 patients in the main ward. Marin walked slowly along the row, reading each chart, watching each face. 3 were sedated. 2 were restrained. 1 was sitting up in her bunk and staring at Marin with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite anything else. Marin had a clean word. 4. Something rawer than anger. Something like the feeling underneath anger, before the anger has had time to form. The 7th patient was her mother. She stopped. Amara Solis was 63 years old, had come to Vareth 5 as part of the original survey crew, had been one of the people who'd stood on this soil before anyone had called it reach below, and said, "Yes, this is livable. Yes, we can grow things here. Yes, people can make a life in this place." She was small and brown-skinned, and had her daughter's same set to the jaw, the same habit of keeping her hands busy. She was lying in the bunk, with her hands folded in her lap, which was wrong. Amara Solis's hands were never folded, never still. Her eyes found Marin's. "You came," her mother said. "I came." Marin sat on the edge of the bunk. "How long have you been in here?" 2 days. Priya brought me in." A pause. "I asked her to." "What happened?" Her mother looked at her hands. "I said some things to your father I don't." She stopped. The line between her brows deepened. I knew they were wrong while I was saying them. I could feel that. But I couldn't stop. It was like watching myself from somewhere else, watching someone use my voice to say things I would never. She closed her eyes. "Is it what I think it is?" "I think so." "The water." "Yes." Her mother nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she'd been expecting bad news and had already decided how to receive it. "Your brother came to see me yesterday. He wasn't." She didn't finish that sentence either. "I know. You have to find him, Marin. He's not himself. None of them are. But Dane especially, he's always been the one who. When something gets under his skin, I'll find him," Marin said. "First I need samples from the water intake. And then I need to talk to you about what you remember from the survey. Before the settlement was built. Before the water system was commissioned." She leaned forward. "Did the Vethkarn ever approach the survey team during the initial assessment period?" Her mother opened her eyes. "Once," she said. The story her mother told was this. On the 42nd day of the initial survey, 3 Vethkarn had appeared at the survey team's camp. Not aggressively, no weapons visible, no territorial display of the kind the contact protocols had prepared them for. They had simply walked into the camp perimeter and stood, the way you stand when you have arrived at a place you were always going to arrive at, and are now waiting for the other party to understand the situation. The team's xenolinguist, a man named Vasil, had attempted formal contact. The Veth Karn had responded. The exchange had been difficult. The 40% comprehension problem. But the gist of what Vasil had managed to translate was this: you are standing in a place where something has been prepared. We are informing you as a courtesy. The preparation is already in effect. Vasil had interpreted this as a territorial warning, a symbolic statement of prior claim to the land. He'd logged it as such in the survey report, flagged it for diplomatic review, and moved on. What he hadn't been equipped to understand, and what Maren understood now, with the cold clarity of hindsight, was that the Veth Karn hadn't been making a symbolic statement. They had been delivering a factual one. The preparation was already in effect. She found Dr. Reyes in the back office, surrounded by reports and specimen containers, and the quiet devastation of someone who has been trying to solve a problem with the wrong tools. The compound, Maren said, setting her kit on the desk. You've isolated it. 3 days ago. I don't have a full profile. Our equipment is. I know. That's why I'm here. Maren opened the kit. I'm going to pull samples from the water intake. I need access to the infrastructure maps. The northern junction is compromised, Reyes said. There was an incident yesterday. One of the maintenance crew, she stopped, pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. He went into the tunnel and didn't come back out. We don't know why. We haven't been able to send anyone in after him, because everyone we have available for that kind of work has been showing deviations in the behavioral monitoring. How many unaffected? Confirmed unaffected. Reyes pulled up a screen, including medical staff, people who've been on restricted rations since we flagged the water. 47. 47 out of 2,417. The rest are progressing. Most of them are still functional, still going through the motions of the routine. The deeper deviations are concentrated in people who've been drinking the settlement water longest, the original survey crew and early settlers. Reyes's voice was careful and professional, and underneath it was something shaking. It seems to be dose dependent. The longer and greater the exposure, the more severe the inhibition breakdown. She paused. Your brother has been here since the survey. 13 months. Maren picked up her equipment. I'll need the infrastructure maps and a security override for the northern tunnel access. Maren? Reyes's voice changed, just slightly. Someone tried to stop me from pulling the water samples. One of the senior administrators, he said. He said the Colonial Authority had already assessed the situation, and that any unauthorized testing of settlement infrastructure was a violation of colony code. A pause. He said it while holding a wrench. Did he hurt you? He threw the wrench at the wall and then walked away like he'd forgotten I was there. Reyes closed her eyes briefly. That's what it's like. It comes and goes. Some of them will seem completely normal, and then it's like watching a light flicker. Maren thought about her mother's phrase, watching myself from somewhere else. The compound is selective, she said. It's not destroying cognition. It's removing the filter, the part of human neurology that sits between impulse and action, that evaluates and decides and defers. It's targeting that specifically. She picked up the infrastructure maps from the desk. They're still in there. All of them. They know what they're doing. They just can't stop themselves. Reyes stared at her. What kind of weapon does that? She said. One designed by something that had a very long time to study us, Maren said, and understood from that study that what makes humans dangerous isn't our impulses. It's our ability to control them. The northern tunnel was cold and smelled of mineral water and old polymer sealant. Maren moved through it with a hand light and the infrastructure map on her wrist display, tracing the path of the main water intake, conduit toward the aquifer junction. The silence here was different from the silence above. Not thinned and wrong, but genuinely empty. The silence of a place where things were functional and purposeless and had no knowledge of what they were carrying. She found the maintenance worker 40 meters in. He was alive. He was sitting with his back against the tunnel wall, and he was taking apart a junction coupling with the focused concentration of a man who was doing something very important, except that the junction coupling was not anything that needed to be taken apart. And the doing of it had already interrupted the flow to one of the secondary distribution lines. He looked up when her light found him, and his expression was not hostile, not confused. He looked the way someone looks when they're been interrupted in the middle of a task and are deciding whether to be annoyed. That needs to be, he started. I know, she said. What's your name? Ferris. A pause. Ferris Ocon, Water Systems. He looked at the coupling in his hands. I came down to check the flow readings, and then I started taking this apart. I don't know why. He said it with no particular distress, just the flat statement of a man reporting a fact. I've been here a while. Are you hurt? No. He turned the coupling over. I can't seem to stop. She sat down next to him. She looked at the coupling. She said carefully, Ferris, I need to get to the Aquifer Junction, past you, and I need you to try something. He looked at her. I need you to put the coupling down, she said. Not because there's a rule that says to. Not because someone told you to. Just because you remember. Do you remember why you came down here? What you were going to do before you started taking that apart? Something moved in his face. Far back, like a light in a very long corridor. Check the flow readings, he said slowly. Right. You came down here to check the flow readings. That's the thing you were going to do. She kept her voice steady and quiet. The other thing, taking apart the coupling that arrived later. That wasn't you planning something. That was just something that happened. She paused. Can you tell the difference between those two things? His hands went still on the coupling. Yeah, he said very quietly. Yeah, I can. Good. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. Put it down, Ferris. Go back up. Go find Dr. Reyes and tell her I sent you. He looked at the coupling for another moment. Then he set it down carefully, like setting down something he'd borrowed and was returning. He stood up. He walked past her without speaking, back toward the tunnel entrance, and she watched the circle of his headlamp recede until it was gone. She turned toward the Aquifer Junction. She had work to do. The compound was organic in origin. She could see that much from the passive sampling data as she drew her specimens. Not synthetic, not manufactured in any process that used the industrial chemistry she could recognize. It was something the Veth Karn had found or grown or cultivated, something that had been refined over time into a precision instrument for what it did. A single molecule as near as she could map it, with a receptor binding profile that was, and this was what made her hands shake slightly as she worked. Not with fear, but with something close to awe. Essentially identical to a class of compounds that human neuroscience had been theorizing about for 2 centuries. The compounds that sat at the exact intersection of threat recognition and behavioral inhibition. The compounds that, if you removed them, didn't make you stupid or violent or anything so simple as that. They made you honest. Not honest in the sense of truth-telling. Honest in the brutal sense. Every impulse, every desire, every fear and appetite and resentment and longing that the frontal cortex had spent a lifetime learning to modulate and defer and sometimes never act on at all. All of it, unmediated. All of it now. The Veth Karn had found the lock. They'd made a key. And they'd put the key in the water and waited for humanity to drink it. She sealed the specimens, logged them, put them in the cold pack compartment of her kit. She thought about what that meant. Not just for Reach Below. For everywhere humanity had settled in the Verath cluster. For every aquifer on every world that had Veth Karn territorial geomarkers, anywhere near the water table. For every human settlement that had been told the water was safe and had believed it. She thought about the 47 unaffected people above her, and the 2,000 plus who weren't. She thought about Ferris Ocon, putting down the coupling because he could still reach the part of himself that remembered what he'd come to do. They're still in there. She packed up her kit and went back up. Finding Dane was harder. She'd known it would be. Her brother was not the kind of man who stayed where people could find him when he was in the middle of something he hadn't figured out yet. He'd always done his best thinking in motion. And in the 13 months he'd been on Vareth 5, he'd learned the terrain the way settlers learn terrain, not as a map but as a body memory. The same way you learn your own house in the dark. She spent 2 hours moving through Reach Below. And those 2 hours were among the hardest she'd had in a long time. Not because of any direct threat. No one moved against her. No one was violent toward her in those 2 hours, though she heard things in the distance that she made careful mental note of and didn't go toward, but because of the faces. She knew these people, not all of them individually, but she knew them in the way you know a community you've been adjacent to for a year, by type, by role, by the particular human texture of a group that has come together around a shared project and a shared choice. Farmers and engineers and teachers and medics and children. And the kind of tireless generalist that frontier communities run on. The people who can fix anything and build anything and will do either without being asked because the work needs doing. She knew them in that way, and she could see them now in the amber afternoon light, doing things that didn't make sense, in the particular way of things that are completely human and completely wrong. A woman sitting in the agricultural allotment, pulling up plants she'd spent months growing, not destructively, not in anger, just steadily pulling them up, as if it had occurred to her to do so, and the occurrence was sufficient reason. 2 men in the far corner of the main plaza, not fighting but on the edge of it, other circling the other with a tension that had no obvious object. A child, maybe 8 years old, standing absolutely alone in the middle of a path, face turned up to the sky, perfectly still, watching Vareth's sun track toward the horizon, with an expression of such complete absorption that it was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Marin kept moving. She found her brother at the northern perimeter fence. He was standing with his back to her, looking out across the long flat toward the Veth Karn territorial marker field. The markers were simple things, upright stones of a particular type, placed at regular intervals. Alien in the precise sense of being made by something that thought differently than she did. In the slanting light, they cast long shadows. "Dane," she said. He didn't turn. "I've been watching them all day," he said. The markers. She came to stand beside him. He looked the way she'd feared he'd look. Not the way their mother had looked. Not that internalized struggle, but something more settled, something that worried her more. A kind of arrived, at peace. "Tell me what you see," she said. "Something old." He was quiet for a moment. "Something that was here a long time before us. We walked in and we said, 'This land is viable. This land is ours to use.' We said it like we'd had a conversation with the land, and the land had agreed. We never asked." "No," she said. "We didn't." She kept her voice even. "Is that what you think about that? Or is that something else talking?" A long silence. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time she heard something underneath the settled peace. A thread of something uncertain. Something that was reaching for her. I used to know the difference. She thought of Ferris Okon, the coupling in his hands. Can you tell the difference between those two things? "Do you remember the night on Caliver Station?" she said, "when we snuck out to look at the stars?" He turned to look at her. "What you said to me," she continued, "about going anywhere. From here, we could get to anywhere." Something shifted in his face, distant and gradual, like weather changing over a long landscape. "Yeah," he said, "that was you. That was who you are." She faced him squarely. "Whatever else is happening right now, whatever you've been thinking about the markers and the land, and what we asked or didn't ask, that's in there too. That's you too." She held his gaze. "I need you to hold on to that." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She could see him working at something internal, working at a distance that had opened up inside him and was trying to close. He said, finally, quietly, "What do you need me to do?" She needed, it turned out, 3 things from him. The first was his recollection of the survey. specifically the aquifer assessment, which he'd participated in as a geological specialist. The second was his access credentials for the Northern Monitoring Station, which was still online and still feeding environmental data to the planetary network, and would, once she had her own sample data integrated, be able to transmit a confirmed contamination report directly to the Colonial Authorities' Xenobiochemistry Division with no intermediary processing. The third thing was harder. The settlement has a population of roughly 47 who are unaffected or minimally affected, she told him, walking as she talked, keeping him moving. Because standing still seemed to cost him something she couldn't afford to spend. The rest are progressing. In the next 72 to 96 hours, based on the behavioral progression curve I've been tracking, we're going to start seeing incidents that the settlement's internal security can't manage. Reyes can sedate, but we don't have the capacity to sedate 2,000 people. She glanced at him. We need a way to slow the progression in the people who are still in the earlier stages. Buy time for the Colonial Authority to respond. Slow the progression, Dane said. He was walking steadily beside her, and his voice had the quality of someone navigating carefully, aware of the ice. Medically, the compound is water-vectored, dose-dependent, which means anyone who stops drinking contaminated water stops receiving new doses. She'd been working through this. The compound has a half-life. It's going to clear from the system over time. I don't know the rate yet. I need a full profile, but clearance is possible. The question is how long it takes, and what happens in the interim. The water reclamation system has an emergency manual override, Dane said slowly. Reroutes intake away from the aquifer draw and onto the emergency tank supply. We brought enough reserve for 60 days. Enough for everyone, if it's rationed. He was quiet for a moment. I know the access point. Northern Infrastructure Hub. Can you get me there? He stopped walking. She stopped too. He was looking at his hands. I had a conversation last night, he said, with one of the survey crew. Fen. You don't know her. She's been here longer than me. He paused. She was talking about the Veth Karn, making a case for letting the settlement go, for leaving. She was very convincing, and I agreed with her. He looked up. I knew I was agreeing with her because of what's in my head right now and not because I actually think that, but I agreed with her, and the agreeing felt real. He held her gaze. I want you to know that I can feel it working on me. I want you to know that, before we go anywhere, together. I know, she said. Marin, Dane. She reached out and took his arm. You called me. You said come down. Come drink the water. See what's real. Do you remember that? He looked pained. Yes. But you also came and stood at that fence. And you waited there. She let that sit. Some part of you knew I was coming. Some part of you put yourself somewhere I'd find you. She released his arm. That part of you, that's the part I'm talking to right now. And that's the part I'm counting on. She started walking again. Let's go to the infrastructure hub. They went through the maintenance corridors beneath the settlement's east block, moving through the particular quiet of underground spaces that are functional and forgotten. The ambient light was low. Maintenance illumination only. The bioluminescent strips that colonial infrastructure used for baseline safety. In the blue-white light, Dane looked older than she remembered. She found herself thinking, as she walked, about what the Veth Karn had understood, and what they'd missed. They'd understood the aquifer. They'd understood humanity, with a precision that implied a depth of study that was frankly remarkable and frankly terrifying. They'd understood the institutional processes of colonial governance well enough to exploit the gap between the time it would take a problem to escalate past human perception and the time it would take the colonial authority to authorize a response. They had thought it through carefully. They had been patient and methodical, and she could acknowledge this while still finding it unforgivable. They had been right about a lot of things. What they had missed, she thought, was the specific way humans propagated information about themselves. Not formal channels, not the colonial reports and survey data and diplomatic correspondence, all of which they'd apparently been reading carefully. The other kind, The mother who calls her daughter and says something wrong, something that isn't her, that sets off an alarm in the daughter, even at a distance. The brother who argues for surrender, but stands at a fence where he can be found. The maintenance worker in the tunnel who can still, when asked the right way, put down what he's holding. The Veth Karn had removed the filter. They'd let everything through, and they'd assumed that what was underneath the filter was the same in humans as it apparently was in whatever species they'd developed this weapon. On naked appetite, stripped of everything else purely destructive. What they'd found, what the compound had found, running its course through 2,000 human nervous systems, was that what humans had underneath the filter was complicated. Yes, there was appetite and resentment and fear and impulse. But there was also, underneath everything, the specific things that had survived 31 years of frontier life in Dan Solis. The ability to go to the fence. The ability to remember Caliver Station. The ability to put yourself somewhere you could be found. They'd removed the filter. They hadn't removed the person. She thought that was a mistake that was going to cost them. The infrastructure hub was a circular room roughly 8 meters across, lined with control panels that hadn't been designed for aesthetics and showed it. 4 months ago, when Marin had last been in reach below on a routine check, she'd walked past this room and had thought, this is the kind of room that only exists in the context of it working properly. The kind of room you never need to think about. Now she stood in the center of it and thought, this is the most important room in this settlement. The emergency water reroute was a physical system, deliberately so. Per colonial infrastructure standards, there were too many scenarios in which a software-only override could be compromised. The physical override was a series of valve controls that had to be operated in sequence, manually, over the course of about 20 minutes. No special credentials required. In the end, it was designed to be operable by anyone in an emergency, which was exactly what this was. Dane knew the sequence he showed her. They worked side by side in the dim light of the infrastructure hub, and Marin found herself watching her brother for the sign she'd been watching for since she'd found him at the fence. The flicker, the drift, the moment when the distance opened up in him. But he held. He moved through the valve sequence with the specific concentration of a man doing a job. He knew, and she thought again, they're still in there. The compound had tried to strip away the thing between him and his worst impulses, but what it had found there, alongside everything else, was competence, memory, the body knowledge of a man who had spent his adult life learning to do things right. The settlement water rerouted to emergency tank supply at 16:42 Vareth local time. The Colonial Authority response, when it came, took 11 hours from the moment Marin's sample data hit the Xenobiochemistry Division's network. Not 60 days, 11 hours. This was faster than anyone, including Kwame, had believed possible, and she would learn later what had driven it. Not just the data itself, though the data was unambiguous and damning in equal measure. It was the supplementary material she'd appended to the transmission. Her mother's recollection of the Veth Karn's visit to the survey camp, Vasil's original log entry, pulled from the survey archive, with her annotation translating what he'd recorded as a territorial warning into what it had actually been, a statement of fact. The preparation is already in effect. That annotation, that reframing of something 11 months old, a single sentence in a survey log, from a diplomatic warning into an act of aggression, was what moved the Colonial Authority from its 60-day observation window to an emergency response in 11 hours. The paper trail, she would be told later, was overwhelming. Not just Vareth 5, 6 other worlds in the cluster, each with an active settlement, each with a water system, drawing from the same aquifer network. 6 other populations, in various stages of the same progression she'd been watching on her feeds. Some earlier, some later, all of them, without exception, drawing from contaminated water. The compound had been placed in the Varath Cluster Aquifer Network before the first human survey team arrived on any of those worlds. The Veth Karn had been planning this for years. The evacuation of Reach Below began at 03. The following morning, when the first Colonial Authority medical transport broke atmosphere, there were 3 transports in the first wave and 7 in the second, and they came in hot. Not the careful, deliberate approach of a standard resupply run, but the urgent, steep, angled drop of ships that had been cleared for emergency priority and were moving accordingly. Marin stood on the landing pad and watched them come down and felt something that was not relief, not yet, but was the specific thing that comes before relief. The loosening of the sustained tension that has been holding you together, the first signal from your body that it might, sometime soon, be allowed to stop. The evacuation was complicated by the obvious fact that you cannot straightforwardly evacuate 2,000 people in various stages of behavioral dysregulation without incident. There were incidents. She dealt with most of them as a medic and let others deal with the rest, and she kept moving because the keeping moving was the thing she knew how to do. Dane stayed close to her through the first hours. He was not getting worse. The water reroute had stopped the inflow, and she could already see, in him and in some of the others, a very slight easing. Nothing dramatic, nothing like a cure. More like the way a storm eases when the worst of it has passed through. The wind still up, the rain still falling, but the sense that the peak has gone and what remains is diminishing. His hands were steadier. His eyes tracked her without effort. At one point, in the organized chaos of the landing pad, with transports roaring overhead and medical teams, moving through the crowd and the amber Verath, dawn just beginning to light the eastern ridge, he stopped walking, and she stopped beside him. "I keep thinking about what I said to you on the comm," he said. "Come down. Drink the water. You don't need to, I need to say it." He faced her. "I know what I was doing. I know what I was trying to do, and I need to say that it came from in me, Marin. The compound didn't put it there. It found it there. All the old arguments about whether we have the right to be here, whether we should push into spaces that were already." He stopped. "Those were my arguments. They've been my arguments for years. The compound just took the fence away." She thought about this. "Then maybe," she said, "those are arguments that deserve to be had after, by people who aren't compromised, through channels where we can actually think about them clearly." She looked at him steadily. "But not this way. Not by the Veth Karn making the decision for us by taking away our ability to decide." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Not this way. The second Colonial Authority wave brought, among other things, a team from the Xeno-Diplomatic Corps, which Marin had not expected, and which told her more about how seriously the situation was being treated than anything else. Xeno-Diplomatic Corps teams did not deploy to emergency medical situations. They deployed when someone, somewhere up the decision chain, had decided that what was happening was not just a medical situation. The team lead was a woman named Counselor Yasira Oha, which Marin also had not expected. The counselor's rank was 3 levels above the standard deployment threshold for a field situation, which meant that this had been escalated past the standard decision infrastructure entirely, and was now being handled at a level she did not normally interact with. Oha was a compact woman, somewhere in her 60s, with a particular quality of stillness that Marin associated with people who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word could cascade into something irreversible. She found Marin in the medical processing station at 09, introduced herself in 2 sentences, and got to the point. "The Veth Karn have submitted a formal communication," Oha said, "through the standard diplomatic channel. Within the last 6 hours. Marin stared at her. "They're contacting us now?" "Specifically, they're contacting us because of the water reroute." Oha sat down across from her. "The compound needs to be replenished at regular intervals. The aquifer is not a passive delivery system. There is an active injection mechanism placed in the aquifer bed at 6 nodes across the cluster. The mechanism detects drawdown rate from human settlements as a proxy for compound consumption. When the drawdown from Reach Below dropped to near 0 last night, their monitoring system registered an anomaly." A pause. They know we've figured it out. Marin absorbed this. What does the communication say? It's layered. We're working on a full translation, which will take time given the 40% comprehension constraint. But the top-level content is clear. Oha looked at her steadily. They want to negotiate. Negotiate. The word tasted strange in her mouth. For the first time in 15 years of formal contact, the Veth Karn have indicated a willingness to discuss the status of human settlement in the Verith cluster. Oha's voice was careful. The specific trigger for this appears to be not the discovery of the contamination. They expected that eventually. The trigger is the speed of the response. The inter-settlement data sharing, the immediate quarantine, and reroute operation across multiple worlds simultaneously. She folded her hands. Something about that response surprised them. Marin thought about it. She thought about her mother calling from a planet away, saying something wrong in the wrong voice, setting off every alarm her daughter had. She thought about Faris Okan, sitting in the tunnel with the coupling in his hands, still able, when asked the right question, to put it down. She thought about the informal network of data sharing that had let her find the pattern the colonial authorities' automated systems had missed because she'd been looking with human eyes at human data and had recognized something familiar in the numbers. She thought about what the Veth Karn had been watching for 11 months in the settlements across the cluster. They'd been watching for the collapse, for the thing underneath the filter to consume itself, the way it apparently consumed other species, naked impulse, eating itself alive. What they'd gotten instead was 47 people with restricted rations and a morbid curiosity about aquifer, chemistry. What they'd gotten was a medical officer in an observation blister, looking at numbers that the algorithms had cleared, finding the pattern anyway, because she knew what human wrong looked like. What they'd gotten was Faris Okan putting down the coupling, and Dane Solis standing at a fence, and her. They thought removing the filter would remove us, she said slowly. Oha looked at her. Pardon? The compound. She was working it out as she said it. It's an effective weapon against a species where the inhibitory layer is the only thing mediating between the organism and self-destruction. Remove the inhibitions, and the organism tears itself apart. That works. Probably works on a lot of species, if that's where the weapon came from. She paused. But human inhibitory function isn't a cage. It's not keeping something terrible in. She searched for the word. It's an editing function. We don't stop wanting things because the inhibitor says don't. We stop, or we choose, or we defer, because we're running a calculation, because we're asking, is this the right time? Will this cause harm? Is there a better way to get the same end? She looked at Oha. Take away the editing function, and you get everything unmediated, including the calculations, including the values, including the thing that made Faris Okan, alone in a dark tunnel, having just done something he couldn't explain, reach for what he actually came there to do. The room was quiet. The Veth Karn didn't remove us, she said. They removed the noise, and what was left was us. The formal diplomatic negotiations that followed over the next 18 months were not simple. Marin was not a diplomat and did not participate directly in those negotiations, though she was called as a technical witness on 4 separate occasions and spent a significant portion of 2 days walking Xenodiplomatic staff through the molecular profile of the aquifer compound and its mechanisms of action in human neurology. The negotiations were conducted with the 40% comprehension constraint and the awareness on both sides that what had just happened in the Verith cluster had changed the parameters of whatever relationship humans and Veth Karn were going to have. What she understood of the outcome, filtered through official channels and Oha's occasional briefings, was this. The Veth Karn had entered the negotiations, expecting to formalize a human withdrawal from the cluster. What they found instead was a human delegation that was angry, yes, deeply and completely and justifiably angry. But that was also with the peculiar stubbornness that characterized humanity in most of the situations she'd been adjacent to in her life, unwilling to allow the anger to be the only thing in the room. There were arguments. There were accusations and justifications, and the brutal, necessary work of establishing what had been done and who had done it. There were, apparently, moments when the Veth Karn translated something the humans had said and responded with something that the human linguists tentatively translated as a variant of the phrase that means approximately. We did not anticipate this response. The 40% comprehension problem was a problem, but every time the linguists managed to clear up a disputed passage, every time the gap between what was said and what was understood narrowed by another percent, what emerged more fully was the sense that the Veth Karn were genuinely, methodically reconsidering something, not their sovereignty claim, not their position on the cluster, but something about their model of the species they'd chosen to use the compound on. The compound itself was removed from the aquifer nodes by a joint team, human and Veth Karn, which was a fact so improbable that Marin had read the official report 3 times before she'd believed it. The Veth Karn had proposed the joint removal themselves. Oha had described this to her as the single most significant development in the negotiations, and Marin thought she understood why. It was the first time the Veth Karn had done something that implied they were operating from a revised model, that what they'd seen in the human response to the contamination had updated something. 6 weeks after the evacuation of Reach Below, the settlement was reoccupied, not by all 2,400 residents. A significant portion of them had chosen, entirely freely and with full access to their own judgment for the first time in months, not to return. Marin thought this was reasonable. She also thought it was worth noting that a significant portion had chosen to come back, and some of them were people who had drunk the contaminated water for 6 or 8 or 12 months, and who came back anyway, to the world they'd been slowly poisoned on, because this was the world they'd chosen, and they were still capable of choosing it. Dane was one of them. She came down for the reoccupation. She didn't stay. She had a ship, a crew, and a next posting. But she came for the day, and in the amber afternoon light of Vareth 5, she stood next to her brother at the northern perimeter fence, and they looked out at the Veth Karn, territorial markers together. "You know they're going to start negotiations about co-presence arrangements," he said. "Shared resource frameworks. The xenodiplomatics are talking about a joint survey of the aquifer system. I heard. 11 years of hostility, and it takes being poisoned to get to the table." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how I feel about that." "Neither do I," she said honestly. "I think both things can be true at the same time. That what they did was wrong, and that what happened afterward was." She paused. "I don't have a clean word for it." "Necessary," he offered. "I was going to say human." She glanced at him. "We have a way of doing the necessary thing at the worst possible moment, and then refusing to let the moment define us." He almost smiled. The first real smile she'd seen from him since she'd come down. "Is that wisdom?" "It's a family trait." She watched the markers throw their long shadows. "From here," she said, "we could get to anywhere." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "we could." 3 months later, Marin was in the observation blister of a different ship, orbiting a different world, watching a different set of feeds. The coffee beside her was warm this time. The situation below was stable. She received a message from Counselor Oha through the diplomatic network. Short, formal, the way Oha wrote everything. The xenolinguistic team had resolved a disputed passage from the early negotiations, one of the statements made by the lead Veth Karn delegate during the initial session, which had been filed as untranslatable pending review. The passage, rendered into English, read approximately, "You removed the mechanism and stayed. We did not account for the possibility that what remained when the mechanism was removed would be sufficient." She read it twice. She thought about Faris Okan and the coupling. She thought about her mother's folded hands and the specific, terrible effort of saying, "I asked her to bring me here." She thought about Dane at the fence, facing the markers, the weight of something old and complicated, and maybe not entirely wrong, pressing on him from the inside, and still, turning when she called his name. She thought about what it was to be human. Not the spectacular parts, the ordinary parts. The cup of coffee you remember to make warm this time. The message you write back to a colleague at the end of a long deployment, just to say, received, understood, thank you. The habit of staying in orbit a little longer than you have to, watching the feeds, making sure. She filed the passage in the mission archive. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the new world turned. The Veth Karn sent the compound to break us down into our lowest parts. What they found there in the basement of human nature, past the inhibitions and the social contracts and the careful civilized layers we've spent 10,000 years building, was us. Still us. Inconveniently, stubbornly, persistently us. Flawed and complicated and full of things we'd rather not admit to, yes, but also full of the thread that goes all the way back. The one that runs through every person who ever stood on a piece of alien soil and chose to be there. That says, I came here for a reason. I remember the reason. I'm not leaving. You can remove the filter from a human being. You cannot remove what the filter was protecting. That, it turned out, was the part they hadn't counted on. That was us. The debriefing took place in a conference room aboard the Colonial Authority vessel. Persistent inquiry. 3 days after the last evacuation transport had lifted from reach below. The room was the standard configuration for these things. A long table, chairs designed for function rather than comfort, a wall panel displaying the Vareth cluster. In false color, cartographic projection with each. Affected settlement marked in a specific shade of amber that the Zipli had apparently not considered might be psychologically unfortunate given the circumstances. Marin sat at the table with Commander Osi to her left, Dr. Reyes to her right, and a row of Colonial Authority officials across from them, who were doing the thing that Colonial Authority officials did in these situations, asking questions they already had the answers to, in the order that would most efficiently produce a record that supported the administrative response they'd already decided on. She was not particularly angry about this. It was how institutions worked. She'd spent her career adjacent institutions and had made her peace with the gap between how things needed to be done and how they got documented. What she was paying attention to, underneath the procedural surface of the debriefing, was the specific question a xenobiochemist named Dr. Henriksen kept circling back to. He was a narrow-shouldered man of about 50. Meticulous in a way that read as genuine rather than performed, and he had a habit of picking up his stylus and setting it down again when he was working through something that wasn't resolving cleanly. The question he kept circling was, why didn't it work faster? He'd asked it 3 different ways in the course of 2 hours. The first time, as a direct inquiry about the compound's half-life and delivery mechanism. The second time framed as a question about the aquifer draw rate and settlement water consumption patterns. The third time, most tellingly, as a question about whether there was any evidence of a Veth Karn monitoring or adjustment presence in the immediate vicinity of reach below during the contamination period. She'd answered all 3 factually and carefully. But on the third answer, she'd paused for just a moment before responding, and in that pause, she'd watched Henriksen's stylus go down and stay down. After the session broke for a recess, she found him at the refreshment station at the end of the corridor. "You think the compound was calibrated wrong?" she said. He looked at her without particular surprise. "I think the compound worked exactly as the Veth Karn intended it to work," he said. "And I think it didn't produce the outcome they expected. And I think those are 2 separate problems." He poured himself water from the dispenser and held the cup without drinking from it. The compound degrades in the presence of certain mineral profiles in the bloodstream, specifically the mineral profile associated with prolonged frontier nutrition, the supplements that colonial medical protocols have everyone on. The combination of the standard supplement regime and the compound's molecular structure creates a metabolic interaction that slows the uptake rate by approximately 30 to 40% compared to a baseline population without supplementation. He paused. you had 47 unaffected people. The unaffected population almost certainly includes a higher than average proportion of individuals who had stronger supplement compliance. Marin thought about Ferris Okan. She'd checked his file after the evacuation, among other things, consistent with Colonial Medical Directive 7. On nutritional supplementation, no deviations in the past 11 months. The Veth Karn modeled a human population without the supplements, she said, or with a different supplement formulation than what Colonial Medical adopted 2 years ago. There was a protocol update. New mineral balance ratios better suited to Verith system soil chemistry. It's a small change, mostly optimizing iron absorption. But it created a population-level metabolic environment the Veth Karn's compound model didn't account for. Henriksen finally drank from the cup, which means their study of human biochemistry was comprehensive but not current. They had excellent data up to a point and missed a revision. She stood with that for a moment. They studied us, she said. They studied us very carefully, very thoroughly, and they missed something recent. Something bureaucratic in a sense. A protocol update, the kind of thing that gets filed in medical compliance records and distributed to colonial postings through administrative channels. He set down the cup. The Veth Karn have been monitoring diplomatic and survey traffic, scientific publications, the major information channels. They may not have been reading Colonial Medical Directive updates. She thought about the 40% comprehension problem. She thought about Vasil and his log entry and the word he'd used, courtesy. They did their homework, she said, and humans buried the answer in the footnotes of a compliance memo. Henriksen almost smiled. It wouldn't be the first time that saved us from something. She slept poorly that night, which was normal for the first days after a sustained crisis. When the body finally had permission to notice everything it had been suppressing, she lay in her bunk on the persistent inquiry and did the thing she always did when she couldn't sleep, made lists, not on paper or a display. In her head, which was where they did the most work, the list she made that night was things the Veth Karn had gotten wrong. They'd gotten the supplement interaction wrong. They'd gotten the institutional response speed wrong. The colonial authorities' emergency protocol was much faster than a standard review, and it had apparently not occurred to the Veth Karn that humans would classify a behavioral contamination event as a medical emergency rather than a social welfare concern, which was a categorization difference that changed the response timeline by a significant factor. They'd gotten the informal communication networks wrong. The way humans shared information laterally, person to person, the mother's phone call and the sister's observation blister, and the 6 hours Kwame spent pounding on the comm relay not because he thought it would work, but because it needed to be on record that he'd tried. They'd gotten the thing underneath the filter wrong, which was the biggest one, and then she thought about the list from the other direction. Things the Veth Karn had gotten right. They'd gotten the aquifer network right. They'd gotten the compound's basic mechanism right. It had worked on the human nervous system exactly as it was designed to. They'd gotten the institutional inertia right, the 60-day observation window, the gap between the problem becoming visible and the authorized response arriving. They'd gotten the isolation right. Reach below was far enough from the nearest established settlement that physical assistance, absent emergency prioritization, would have taken weeks to arrive. They'd been right about a lot. They'd been right about enough that, under any number of slightly different circumstances, it would have worked. Under slightly different circumstances, Marin wouldn't have been in the observation blister. She would have been on the surface like her brother, with her hands around a glass of locally sourced water. And she would have drunk it because it was efficient and fine. And the reclamation system had been certified and tested. She would have done it on day one. And if she had, there would have been no 47. There would have been no one to notice. And the colony would have run the course the Veth Karn had designed for it. She made another list, things that would have been different. It wasn't a productive list. she abandoned it. She thought instead about her mother's hands, folded in her lap in the medical station bunk, the specific wrongness of their stillness. She thought about the effort visible in her mother's face. Not the effort of the illness, but the effort of the person inside the illness. The continuous work of staying present to yourself when something is trying to make you less than you are. I knew I was agreeing with her, Dane had said. And I agreed anyway. That was the hard part. Not the easy violence of full behavioral collapse. The children with the tires, the sheriff with the rifle, the incidents she'd navigated across the settlement. Those were the visible parts. The part that frightened her more was what Dane had described. The compound working on the person who could still see it working. The slow erosion of the distance between knowing and doing. Because that erosion, she knew it, not from the compound, from life. From the long, ordinary grind of being a person who knows what the right thing is and still sometimes does the other thing. Not because the knowledge failed, but because the distance collapsed and the impulse arrived before the thought did. Every human being she'd ever known had that experience. The Vethkarn, in their precision, had found the exact lever of it. They just pushed harder than the mechanism was designed to receive. Pushed hard enough that it became visible. Named. A thing you could point to and say, "That is not me. I can see the difference. I know which one of these is mine." She wasn't sure that would have happened, absent the extremity. She wasn't sure humans noticed the ordinary version of that erosion with anywhere near the same clarity. She added this to the list of things the Vethkarn had gotten wrong. They'd made the lever too obvious. The formal negotiating sessions began 22 days after the evacuation, at a neutral orbital location, a station that had been used for Sarathi contact protocols 3 years earlier, and had been hastily adapted for Veth-Karn standards, which mainly involved adjusting the ambient temperature and removing several items of furniture that apparently intersected poorly with Veth-Karn proximic sensibilities. Marin was not in the room for the sessions. She was back on the Ardent Crossing, finishing her mission documentation, processing the medical cases from the evacuation, and waiting for the professional inevitability of being posted somewhere new. But she received OASC briefings, and she read them carefully, and she thought about them, the way she thought about the biometric feeds, looking for the pattern underneath the surface. The pattern she found was this. The Veth-Karn had come to the negotiating table expecting to manage a human withdrawal with minimal concession. What they'd encountered instead was a human diplomatic team that was not withdrawing, and was also, with considerable skill, not attacking. They were doing the harder thing. They were staying present in the room, with the full weight of what the Veth-Karn had done, on the table and acknowledged, and insisting on a conversation about what came next. The Veth-Karn, as far as the xenolinguists could tell through the 40% comprehension limit, were not accustomed to this. Their historical precedent for territorial dispute resolution, extrapolated from the partial records the Xenodiplomatic Corps had assembled, seemed to run along cleaner lines: an assertion, a challenge, an outcome, a settlement. The recursive process of two parties sitting in the same room after one party had unambiguously done a harmful thing to the other party, and working towards something that neither withdrawal nor victory, but some third arrangement that hadn't existed before. This, apparently, did not have a clear Veth-Karn procedural framework. OHA described one session in a briefing note as follows. The lead Veth-Karn delegate had entered the room in what the xenolinguists characterized as a state of structured certainty, and left it, after 6 hours, in something that translated approximately as structured uncertainty. The note flagged this as significant. Marin read it 3 times and thought, yes, that is significant. Because structured uncertainty, in her experience, was where most of the actually important things happened. It was the state you were in, when your model of a situation had been updated, and your response framework hadn't caught up yet. It was uncomfortable. It was also, if you didn't panic out of it, extremely productive. She thought about her own structured uncertainty 3 weeks ago, sitting in the observation blister with her cold coffee and her biometric feeds, before she'd named what she was seeing, before she'd decided to go down. She hoped the Vethkarn delegate had someone to talk to. In that state, the occupation of Reach Below was preceded by a week of remediation work, flushing the settlement water system, testing and certifying the emergency tank supply, running environmental monitors across the perimeter to confirm the aquifer injection nodes had been sealed. The joint removal team that worked on the node sealing included, as the official report noted with some understatement, 2 Vethkarn specialists who had apparently been involved in the original installation. Their participation had been requested by the Colonial Authority and agreed to, after a delay of 48 hours, by the Vethkarn diplomatic delegation. Marin read this detail in the official report and sat with it for a while. It was, she thought, the most human thing the Vethkarn had done so far. Not because it was necessarily a sign of remorse. She wasn't willing to make that inference from limited data and a 40% language gap, but because it was an act that acknowledged the connection between what had been done and the people doing the undoing. It would have been easier, logistically, for the Colonial Authority to seal the nodes without Vethkarn assistance. They had the technical data from the compound analysis. They could have managed it. The Vethkarn had offered their specialists anyway, and the choice, whatever it meant in Vethkarn terms, meant something in human terms. It looked like accountability. It looked like standing next to what you'd built and helping to take it apart. It looked like, and she was fully aware that she was projecting here, that the translation gap made this reading speculative. It looked like they understood that what they had done required more than a diplomatic statement to address. She flagged this in her notes and sent it to OHA's team as an observation for whatever it was worth on the day of the reoccupation, before Marin's shuttle lifted back to the Ardent Crossing. She went to find Faris Okan. He was in the water systems facility, which was appropriate. He was checking the flow readings on the newly certified tank supply. The actual flow readings this time, in the actual way he'd come to the tunnel to check them 11 months ago, before the coupling had gotten in the way. He was focused, methodical, doing a job with the quiet competence of a man who was good at his work and knew it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "Faris," she said. He looked up. He recognized her. Something in his face shifted. Not quite embarrassment, not quite relief. Something between the two. Dr. Solis. Just Marin. She came in. "How are you doing?" He turned back to the panel, adjusted a reading, noted something on his display. "Better," he said. "Clear." He paused. I've been thinking about what you said in the tunnel." "You don't need to, I want to." He set down his tool, turned to face her. He was a big man, somewhere in his 40s, with the particular physical ease of someone who worked with their hands and had never needed to think about it. "You asked me if I could tell the difference between the thing I came to do and the other thing." He met her eyes. "I've been thinking about that question a lot. Not just about what happened down here." He paused. "About regular stuff, too. Things I do, and then wonder about." "Yeah," she said, "is that?" He seemed to be looking for the right framing. "Is that what it's supposed to be like? Being human? That you're always doing that? Checking which thing is the right thing?" She thought about it honestly. "I think so," she said. "I think that's the job. Not having the right impulse all the time. Just being able to tell the difference, often enough to do something about it." He nodded slowly. "The compound made that harder. Yes, but you could still reach it. When someone asked the right question, most of the time," she said. "That's what we found out. That most of the time, even under the worst conditions, the ability to tell the difference doesn't go away completely. It just gets." She looked for the word. "It gets expensive. It costs more to get to, but it's still there." Faris was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came to the tunnel to do a job, and I still knew what the job was, even when I was doing the other thing." "Yes, that matters," he said. "Yes," she said again. "I think that's the whole thing, actually. She was quiet on the shuttle up. Not the heavy silence of someone processing something difficult, but the particular quiet that follows a period of sustained effort when you have not quite arrived at rest, but can see it from where you are. The amber light of Varath's sun slanted through the viewport as the shuttle climbed, turning the clouds below into something that looked like hammered gold. She thought about the compound and what it had done and what it had failed to do and what the failure meant. She thought about the species that had built it, the 11,000 years of prior claim, the studied patience, the depth of planning, the fundamental miscalculation at the center of all of it. She did not think they were evil. She wasn't sure evil was a useful category for what had happened here. She thought they were old and methodical and operating from a model of organic life that had been built on different data than humans provided. She thought that the Vethkarn, looking at humanity across the table in those negotiating sessions, were doing what humans did when they encountered something that didn't fit their existing categories, updating, slowly, uncomfortably, with the resistance that comes from having invested enormously in a model and having it fail. She thought that they might, in time, understand what they'd run into. She thought about what they'd run into. Not heroes, not the spectacular version of humanity that got told in the big stories. The ones about single decisive battles and brilliant individuals whose genius changed everything. The ordinary version. A woman in an observation blister who noticed something in the feeds because she was looking with human eyes, a maintenance worker who could still, when asked, remember why he'd come. A brother standing at a fence, a doctor in a facility who asked to be brought in before things got worse, a settlement medical officer who had been holding her own terror in one hand and her sample kit in the other for 36 hours straight without once considering the alternative. The ordinary version was this. Humans, presented with something that tried to strip away what they were, had gone very far down before they'd found the bottom, and then they'd held. Not heroically, not without cost, not without the marks that a thing like that leaves on you, but they'd held, and then they'd come back. The ardent crossing was exactly where she'd left it. This was, in her experience, the reliable thing about ships. They stayed where you put them, which was more than could be said for most things. Kwame met her at the dock bay, not formally, just standing there with 2 cups of coffee, the way people stand when they've been waiting, and are choosing not to make it into an event. She took the cup. It was warm. Report, he said. Filed. The full medical documentation is in the system. Xenobiochemistry division has the compound profile. OHA's team has my supplementary observations. She drank. How's the crew? Stable. Worried about their friends on the surface. Happy to hear the surface is reoccupied. He drank from his own cup. The colonial authority sent a commendation. Standard language. You were named specifically. They put me in the report. They put you in the report 3 times, he said mildly. She thought about how she felt about that, and discovered she didn't feel much about it, either way. Being named in a report was the kind of thing that mattered when you were early in your career, and needed the documentation. At 31, with a decade of frontier medical work behind her, it was furniture. The 6 other cluster worlds, she said. Status? All 3 of the early-stage contaminations have been confirmed and remediated. 2 of the mid-stage worlds are in active evacuation. The 6th, he paused. The 6th had the highest exposure duration, settlement of about 1800. They're managing, but it's going to be a longer recovery window. The compound clearance rate is slower with extended exposure. He was quiet for a moment. Henriksen's team is working on an accelerant, something to speed the metabolic clearance. The supplement interaction gives us a baseline. That's what he said. Kwame turned toward the observation deck corridor. Walk with me? They walked. Ardent Crossing was large enough that walking through it was genuine exercise, which was one of the reasons Kwame was always moving. He thought better in motion, which was something they had in common. The corridor lights were on night cycle, which made the ship feel smaller, more contained. The 6th world she said. Yeah, who's the medical officer? Someone I know from the Caliver posting. Her name is Fen. He glanced at her. She's good. I know Fen, Marin said, and stopped walking. Dane's voice, in the corridor between the infrastructure hub and the perimeter fence, 3 days ago. I had a conversation last night with one of the survey crew, Fen. She was talking about the Veth Karn, making a case for letting the settlement go. Feven is medical on the 6th world, she said carefully. She went there from Reach Below about 6 weeks ago. Transfer posting. Kwame was reading her face. What? Fen has been on Vareth cluster worlds for at least 11 months. She was part of the early survey rotation. She was at Reach Below, and she was. She stopped, worked through it. She was one of the ones who was deep into the progression, making arguments for leaving, for surrendering the cluster. She transferred to the 6th world 6 weeks ago. I'm not saying she stopped again. I'm saying she had a very high exposure duration, and the 6th world is the worst case cluster scenario right now, and she's the medical officer on site. She looked at Kwame. Someone needs to go. Someone who knows her. Kwame looked at her for a long moment. You just got back, he said. I know. You haven't slept more than 4 hours in. I know. She picked up her coffee from where she'd set it against the corridor wall. It was still warm. That was the reliable thing about good thermodynamics. File the paperwork. He looked at her, and she could see the calculation again. The same one as before. The risk against the need, against the clock. She could also see the thing that came after the calculation. The thing that was more important than the calculation. I'll file the paperwork, he said. The shuttle to the 6th world left at 06. She was in her seat with her kit and her mission documentation and a full thermos of coffee, watching the ardent crossing recede through the forward viewport as the shuttle dropped toward atmosphere, when she thought of something she'd been meaning to think about for days and hadn't had the space for. The Veth Karn had come to the survey team's camp on day 42. They had looked at the humans standing on their soil, and they had said, "We are informing you as a courtesy." The preparation is already, in effect, a courtesy. She'd been treating that word as a formality, as the diplomatic equivalent of a warning shot, the gesture toward communication that preceded the act you'd already decided on. But she'd been thinking about translation, and about the 40% gap, and about the specific word the xenolinguist had chosen. Courtesy was a word that implied regard for the other party. It was a word that implied the other party mattered enough to inform. You did not warn something you intended to simply eliminate. You did not stand in its camp and tell it what was coming if the outcome was already entirely fixed. There was, in the act of informing, some acknowledgement that the information might be useful, that something might be done with it. Vazil had heard it as a territorial warning. She now thought it was something else, something that the 40% gap had stripped of its full meaning and left as a husk that looked like a warning, and wasn't. The Veth Karn had told the survey team, the preparation is in effect. They had come in person to say this. They had chosen to say it. She thought about what that meant, if the translation was right. She thought about a species 11,000 years old that had found a precise and effective method of clearing trespassers from its territory, and had used it, and had also, in the using, stood in the trespassers' camp and said, "We are telling you this." She thought about what Fen had said to Dane, under the compound's influence, about the Veth Karn's right to claim the soil, the argument that Dane had agreed with, the argument Dane had also known he was agreeing with for the wrong reasons. She thought that the 40% gap ran in both directions. She thought that there might be, somewhere in the other 60% of what had been said and not translated, something worth knowing. She filed this as an observation for Oha's team in the mission notes, marked as speculative. Then she looked out the viewport at the new world below, a different world this time, greener, smaller moons, and thought about Fen and what she'd find there and what question she'd need to ask. She'd find the right question. She always did. That was the job. Years later, when people asked her about the Vareth cluster, about the contaminations, the evacuations, the negotiations that had produced the first co-presence framework in human Veth Karn history. She said the same thing every time, in different words that always meant the same thing. The Veth Karn thought they understood us. They'd studied us for a long time, and they thought they understood what was underneath, what we were, when you stripped away the civilization. They thought what they'd find was the thing they were afraid of, just appetite, just impulse, just the raw animal, grinding against its own better judgment and losing. What they found was people. Tired, complicated, frequently mistaken, occasionally brilliant, stubbornly attached to the things they'd chosen, and the people they loved and the reasons they'd come this far. People who could, even in the middle of the worst of it, answer a question honestly when asked directly. People who could put down the coupling. That's not a special thing. That's not heroic. That's just what humans are, most of the time, when you get down to the part that doesn't wash off. They built a very precise weapon, and they aimed it very carefully, and they hit us with it as hard as they knew how, and we were still there afterward. I don't know what they expected. I don't know if they had a word for it, in their language, in the 60% we still can't reach. But I know what I'd call it. If someone asked me to name what happened in the Varath cluster in the year of the contaminations, I'd call it what it was, humans being human, even when something very old and very methodical did its absolute level best to make that impossible. Turns out that's enough. That's been enough every time so far. I see no particular reason to expect it to stop being enough now.